chilled spines. Settle in, get cozy, and prepare for some spine-tingling relaxation. Here we blend ASMR with a touch of horror to lull you into a world of unsettling calm. Let's begin with our first story. It is called The Voice in the Walls. You live in an old apartment building, tucked away in the quieter parts of town. The place has its quirks, groaning pipes, flickering lights, and drafty windows, but it's home, or so you thought. It all started one night when you were lying in bed, half awake. You heard a faint scratching sound. At first, you figured it was just the pipe settling or maybe a mouse in the walls. But the noise had an odd, rhythmic quality to it, almost as if something or someone was trying to make contact. You closed your eyes, shrugged it off, and tried to sleep. A few nights later, the scratching returned, accompanied by something new. Whispers. It was so faint that at first you thought it was just the wind, or maybe one of your neighbours, but the whispering didn't stop. And it wasn't coming from the hallway or the next room. It was coming from inside the wall, right beside your bed. You sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but you couldn't make out the words. Every time you leaned closer, the whispering would stop. As the night stretched on, the whisper grew softer, fading away until silence settled around you once more. The whispers became a nightly occurrence. You'd hear them in the quiet hours, always low, always just on the edge of understanding. They would sometimes trail off into what sounded like a sob or a low moan. Each time you tried to decipher the words, they'd stop. During the day, everything would be normal. No voices, no scratching. It was only at night that the strange noises would return, creeping back like an old, forgotten memory. One night, you decided to record the sounds with your phone, hoping to capture whatever was lurking in your walls. You pressed record, set the phone on your nightstand, and waited. The whispering came, faint as ever. But this time, you could hear something, a name. It sounded like Sarah. In the morning, you played back the recording. At first it was just static, followed by the faint sound of scratching. And then you heard it. A voice so close it sent shivers down your spine. Sarah. Sarah, help me. Disturbed and curious, you start digging into the building's history. You ask your landlord if anything strange had ever happened in your apartment. The landlord looks at you with a strange expression, hesitating before telling you that years ago, a woman named Sarah had indeed lived there. She had disappeared without a trace. Her family, her friends, everyone was left in the dark. Some said she ran away. Others thought she met a darker fate. Your landlord lowers his voice. They never found her, you know. The information haunts you. That night, when the whispering begins, you finally gather the courage to respond. Sarah, you say softly, your voice barely above a whisper. Are you there? There's a long silence, and then the whisper returns, closer this time. Yes. I'm here. The voice grows bolder with each passing night. You begin to notice patterns in the whispering, a specific time, a specific rhythm. Some nights, Sarah sounds desperate, as if she's struggling to hold on to something. Other nights, she sounds angry, almost vengeful. One night, she begs you to open the wall. She says it over and over, her voice growing frantic. You're terrified, but you can't shake the feeling that she's reaching out to you, that she's somehow trapped, driven by a combination of fear You borrow tools from a neighbour and start to chip away at the wall by your bed. The plaster crumbles, revealing layers of old wood and dust. As you dig deeper, the whispers grow louder, more intense, filling the room with a cold, suffocating presence. And then you find something. Behind the wall is a narrow, hidden room, no bigger than a closet. It's dark, damp, and smells of decay. Inside there is a small, makeshift bed, covered in yellow and brown stains. Scattered among the dust and debris, you find remnants of a life once lived. A book, a broken locket, and a faded photograph tucked inside. It's Sarah. In that moment, you feel a chilling realization. Sarah didn't leave. She was trapped here, behind these walls, forgotten by the world. Her whispers had been her only connection to the outside, her only plea for help. And now, you were the one who had finally heard her. But before you can react, a shadow flickers at the corner of your vision. You turn, heart pounding, and see a figure standing at the entrance of the hidden room. It's Sarah, or what's left of her. Her eyes are blood red, her skin pale, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. She reaches out toward you, fingers claw-like, her face filled with anger and betrayal. You try to run, but Sarah's presence fills the room, pressing down on you, suffocating you. Her whispers grow louder, now filled with rage. "You let me die here," she hisses, her voice echoing through the walls. "You forgot me." Desperate, you scream that you didn't know, that you're sorry, but Sarah doesn't care. Her anger, her pain, her need for vengeance have consumed her. She lunges at you, her cold, bony fingers wrapping around your throat. You feel yourself slipping, your vision blurring as the room grows darker and darker. And then there was silence. Days later, the landlord checks in on you, having not seen or heard from you in a while. He enters your apartment, but it's empty. The bed is neatly made, your belongings untouched. Everything is in its place, as if you had simply vanished. The landlord sighs, shaking his head, muttering something about people leaving without a word. He walks toward the door, but pauses when he hears a faint sound coming from the wall by the bed. A whisper. The story of Sarah fades, leaving only the unsettling memory of her whispers. The air feels charged with lingering fear. Take a breath and try to shake off the feeling that she's still watching. Check your surroundings. Convince yourself that it's just a story, but something in the quiet of the night insists otherwise. After all, whispers and shadows seem to thrive in places forgotten by time. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you might stumble upon something hidden in the dark. In fact, there's a story I know, one that took place in an old, abandoned house at the edge of town. Are you ready to hear about the Shadow Keeper? The house has stood there for decades, its darkened windows like hollow eyes, staring out at anyone who dared approach. Most people didn't dare to. They said it was cursed, a place where those who entered rarely came back the same. Shadows lurked there, unbound by light, slipping through cracks and crevices, watching. One night, two friends, Lisa and Danny, decided to explore the house. They were skeptics, laughing off the idea of spirits and curses as they made their way through overgrown weeds and rusted gates to the front door. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and their phones, they entered, their laughter fading as the silence soon swallowed them whole. It was musty inside, damp, smelling of mould and age. flashlight flickered as they walked through the entrance hall, its beam barely penetrating the shadows clinging to the walls, which were lined with mirrors. Creepy, but nothing to worry about, Danny noted, though his voice sounded thin in the dark. But as they moved through the house, they couldn't shake the strange feeling that was building. Mirrors lined nearly every room, their cracked and dusty surfaces reflecting slivers of movement. It felt as though there was something behind them, something that was watching them from every angle, scrutinizing their every move. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, slipping away whenever they turned their heads. Lisa laughed nervously, saying it was just the way the light hit the dust, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more. They eventually stumbled upon a room at the end of a long hallway, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, a chill lingered, far colder than the rest of the house. The walls were lined with mirrors of all shapes and sizes, each one angled slightly toward the centre. In the middle of the room, there was a small, weathered wooden box, as if waiting for them. Danny shrugged, trying to act brave. "We're here for a thrill, right?" he said, stepping into the room and nudging the box with his foot. It creaked open, revealing a strange, black stone about the size of a fist. Its surface was smooth and glossy, but the longer they looked, the more it seemed to absorb the light. Lisa reached out to touch it, but Danny stopped her. "Don't. This place already feels off," he whispered, his usual bravado quickly fading. But the stone drew Lisa in. She couldn't look away. She took it into her hands. Then, without warning, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She gasped, turning sharply, but there was no one there. Danny looked at her, concerned. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice shaky. Danny nodded, swallowing hard. Something else was in the room. They could feel it, a presence that slithered in the corners, just beyond the mirror's reflection. A voice, low and hissing, filled the room, echoing off the mirrors. It was unintelligible, yet it sent chills down their spines. They spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but all they saw was their own terrified reflections staring back at them. And then, in the mirrors, they saw something else. A figure, draped in darkness, standing behind them, its face obscured. It was tall, impossibly thin, with fingers that stretched far longer than humanly possible. They turned, but no one was there. Only the mirrors showed its shape, its empty eyes staring at them. Alarmed, they backed away, but no matter where they moved, the mirrors reflected the figure standing behind them. The voice returned, more forceful, more menacing. "You're mine now!" Danny grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her toward the door, but something was suppressing them, slowing their steps, as if they were moving through muddy water. Shadows pooled at their feet, swirling around their legs, making it harder to escape. As they struggled to escape, each mirror they passed showed the figure chasing them, its hand stretching out with an unnatural reach, drawing closer and closer with every step. They made it to the entrance hall, heartbeats thundering, breath hitching as they fumbled with the front door. But it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and the shadows around them thickened, coalescing into that dark figure now blocking their path. It hissed, its voice echoing through the empty house. In desperation, Danny remembered the stone Lisa had taken. Maybe it's his. Maybe, if we give it back, he stammered. Lisa snatched the black stone out of her pocket, holding it out, as if offering it to the figure. But the shadow figure only growled, its voice filled with a dark, hollow mirth. Lisa's hand burned where she held the stone, the sensation spreading through her veins like ice. She tried to drop it, but her hand wouldn't release it, as if it had fused to her skin. The figure figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes boring into her, and she finally understood. The stone was a curse, passed on to anyone who disturbed it. It was a tether, a chain that bound her to the house, and to it, to the shadow itself. Danny looked on helplessly, his mind racing. He couldn't leave her, but he also knew that staying meant something far worse. With trembling words, he asked, "What do you want from us?" The shadow figure tilted its head. "Only what's mine," it replied, as shadows began to coil around Lisa, pulling her toward the mirrors. Lisa screamed, struggling against the invisible force, but it was no use. Danny tried to pull her back, but the shadows grew stronger, pulling her deeper into the darkness. Her voice grew faint, fading as the shadows swallowed her whole, leaving only her terrified reflection staring out from within the mirrors. Danny stumbled backward, breathless, as the shadow figure loomed over him, its long fingers stretched as if reaching for him. Without a second thought, he ran, nearly tripping over his own feet in his rush to escape. He didn't look back as he finally wrenched open the front door and stumbled out into the night, feeling the weight of the house's curse lingering on his shoulders. In the days that followed, Danny tried to forget, tried to tell himself it was all just a nightmare. He locked himself in his apartment and refused to answer calls from anyone. He barely slept. The police soon came looking for him. He had been the last person seen with Lisa, and now she was missing. They knocked on his door, and when he didn't answer, they returned with a warrant. The officers found him in a dark room, curtains drawn, his face pale and hollow. All the mirrors in the house were covered with duct tape. They asked what happened, where Lisa was, but Danny barely spoke, mumbling something about shadows and mirrors. The police were suspicious, but all he could say was that Lisa was gone, trapped somewhere he couldn't reach. They searched his apartment, hoping to find evidence, a clue to where Lisa might have gone, or what he could have done to her. But there was nothing. No signs of a struggle, no evidence of foul play, just Danny, eyes darting fearfully to the mirrors, shrinking away from his own reflection. Every time he looked in a mirror, he saw her, Lisa staring back at him, her face twisted in terror, her eyes pleading for help. And sometimes, when the night was especially quiet, he could hear the shadow keeper calling for him, reminding him that he, too, would eventually return to the house, because once you've seen the shadow keeper, you belong to him. The story of the shadow keeper will soon be forgotten, just like many local lore that are only whispered about in secret. It may linger in the corners of your mind, but as the night wears on, the shadows begin to shift again, taking on new forms. There's always another story, another mystery lurking in the quiet corners of this world. And tonight, we're not leaving the darkness just yet. This next tale takes us deeper into the unknown, to a place that most would consider long forgotten. An old hotel where time itself seems to have frozen. People have come and gone, but none of them ever stay for long. And those who do, well, they don't always leave. Are you ready to hear it? In a small town that was hidden away from most maps and forgotten by most people, stood the Marlowe Hotel. It was a relic of a different time, tall, imposing, and weathered by years of neglect. The building had once been grand, bustling with life, hosting travellers from far and wide, but now it was only a shell of its former self. The windows were boarded up, the paint peeling away in long strips, and the air outside was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Most people know nothing of it, passing by without sparing a single glance, save for the rare moments was a rumour, a story that had been passed down by a few, a secret shared only among the locals. It was said that anyone who spent the night in room 317 never came out the same. Some said the room itself was cursed. Others claimed it was haunted by the spirits of past guests. But the most terrifying part, no one had ever seen the person who stayed in room 317. Not once. It had been a few months since anyone had stayed at the Marlow Hotel, and it seemed the old stories were just that. Stories. That was, until one quiet evening when a man named Thomas arrived in town. He was passing through, needing a place to stay for the night. He was an ordinary man who, unfortunately, knew nothing of the tales of the Marlow. Mrs. Hawthorne had worked at the Marlow Hotel for as long as she could remember. She had heard the stories, seen the guests who checked in but never quite checked out, but no matter how much she wanted to warn them, there was little she could do. The hotel, after all, had its own way of claiming people, and the more she tried to resist, the stronger its hold on her seemed to grow. She greeted Thomas with a tight-lipped smile when he walked in, asking for a room. She handed him a key to a room in the second floor, but his eyes glinted as he saw something behind her. She knew that look. She knew that it wouldn't be long before the room would call to him, no matter what she said. "How about that one?" 317, he said. At first she hesitated. She thought about insisting that he take the room she had offered, but then something changed. Perhaps it was the weariness of the years, the endless cycle of the hotel's twisted grip on those who entered. She had come to understand that it was useless to resist the pull of room 317. With a deep breath, she handed him the key to the cursed room. Maybe, just maybe, this man would be the one to break the cycle. Thomas took the key and made his way up the creaking staircase. The hotel seemed deserted, the silence nearly deafening. Each step echoed through the halls, amplified by the building's emptiness. The door to room 317 was old, its wood warped with age. Thomas turned the key in the lock, the sound of the metal scraping against the mechanism making him wince. When the door swung open, he was met with a room that seemed to have been frozen in time. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture covered in dust, and a heavy velvet curtain was drawn across the window, blocking out the dim light of the afternoon. A single, worn-out bed stood in the centre of the room, with an old wooden dresser and a mirror that seemed to reflect more than it should. The air was still, almost too still, as though the room hadn't seen fresh air in years. He wondered why he had insisted on this room, but then decided that all the rooms in this old hotel must be in a similar state. He shook off the unease creeping up his spine, placed his suitcase on the bed, and went about unpacking. Whatever happened, he would spend the night without fear. He was a man of reason, not superstition. As the sun began to set, the room grew colder, the shadows stretching across the walls. The light from the lamp flickered once, twice, then steadied. Thomas glanced at the mirror, where his own reflection stared back at him with an intensity that felt off. And then it happened. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just showing Thomas anymore. It was him, but different. At first his reflection stood still, as if waiting for something, but then it moved when Thomas clearly didn't. His reflection tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion, as if studying him. It wasn't mimicking his movements anymore. No, it was doing something else, something that felt wrong. The real Thomas froze. His reflection smiled, not in a way he could ever replicate. It was stretched unnaturally wide, as if it was enjoying something that shouldn't be there. The corners of its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that Thomas himself hadn't made. He hadn't even thought about mind playing tricks?" he muttered, forcing himself to look away. But the reflection wasn't finished. It moved again. This time it raised its hand, and Thomas felt a strange, cold sensation, as though his own hands were forced to move. But his hands were stuck to his side. Thomas stood still, too stunned to respond. The reflection, however, dashed toward the edge of the mirror in a split second. Its gaze was locked on Thomas from beyond the glass, calculating, studying his every move. Thomas stepped backward, his heart racing. His eyes was glued to the mirror, terrified of what the thing inside might do next. Cold sweat prickled down his neck. Then he heard it. The sound of his own reflection, his own voice, but distorted. "Come closer." The reflection's hand beckoned him, as if urging him to follow his command. Its eyes were wide, crazed, its mouth upturned in a sickening smirk. His pulse was erratic. He was shaking, his breath quickening, as his reflection leaned toward him, its face pressed against the glass now. Without warning, it raised its hand, and Thomas felt the sharp, painful sensation of his own hand slapping his face. He couldn't stop it. It was moving against his will. His reflection was controlling him with ease. Thomas gasped, fighting for control, but to no avail. The reflection grinned. It pressed its hand to the glass, pushing against it, as though trying to break free. Suddenly, the room was filled with murmurs. Dozens, maybe hundreds of voices, whispering in unison, urging him to leave, to run before it was too late. The reflection's lips parted, and his own lips followed. "You're not leaving," he heard himself say. The mirror began to crack. Lines spider-webbed across its surface, spreading like veins. Desperate, Thomas moved to escape, but no matter where he turned, he felt the presence of the reflection enveloping him. It was as if it was everywhere, mirroring him with twisted intent. Then, as if to mock his every attempt to break free, the door blasted open on its own. Thomas ran toward it. He wasn't going to wait for it to slam shut. His feet moved before his mind could tell them to, and he stumbled into the hallway. But the moment he passed through the door frame, something cold, like ice, went through him. He clutched his chest, gasping for breath. The world around him began to swirl. The next thing he knew, he saw it again. His reflection, but this time, it wasn't just standing there. It was moving freely. It was no longer confined to the glass. Now it was him, Thomas, that was trapped inside the mirror. "Thanks," the reflection said, its eyes wild and full of malice. Thomas couldn't move. He banged on the mirror, but it refused to budge. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the mocking laughter of his own reflection. The world around him began to blur. His body grew heavier, his vision fading. His body moved on its own, forced to mimic every movement the entity on the other side made. The reflection took one final step and whispered into the mirror, "Now, I am you." And everything went black. The next morning, Thomas checked out, his movements stiff and mechanical. He placed the room key on the counter with a casual smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Mrs. Hawthorne was standing behind the reception. She looked up and fell silent for a moment before saying, "Good morning. How was your stay?" Thomas nodded smoothly, too smoothly. Couldn't be better. Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze lingered on him a moment longer. She had seen this happen before, and she wasn't surprised. With a sigh, she gave a resigned nod, knowing this was the fate of anyone who crossed the threshold of room 317. "Goodbye," she said softly, as the stranger walked out of the hotel, ready to release whatever chaos he had in mind onto the world. Mrs. Hawthorne sighed, the weight of years of history pressing down on her. Another soul claimed by the room, another soul who never left the same, or left at all. The Marlow Hotel continue to stand, watching, waiting for the next traveller to make the mistake of stepping inside. The room waits for its next guest, and the shadows continue to linger, just out of sight. But perhaps you're safe. After all, you're only listening to a story, or are you? Good night, my friends. May your dreams be sweet and peaceful, free of shadows and unease, unlike the tales we've shared tonight. Rest well, and remember, not all stories stay where they belong. Sometimes they come to life when you least expect it.